The American empire, its power rests mainly on its ability to control maritime trade. It's able to control key maritime choke points like the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Gibraltar. And the great fear is that the Eurasian continent would unify under great power. So in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a British strategist named Mackinder, and he argued that the greatest threat to the British Empire was the rise of a Eurasian power, whether it be the Ottoman Empire, whether it be the French, the Germans, or the Russians. Because if that power were to arise, that power would unify both Europe and Asia and connect the entire Eurasian continent through railways, and then absorb the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia into a continental trading bloc that would negate the naval power of the British Empire. And the British Empire only had naval power. It didn't have the population to sustain a land army. We saw that in World War I and World War II. So the entire strategy of the British was to create as much discontent and chaos in Eurasia as possible. And if a great power were to arise, they basically go to war against that power. So we first saw the strategy play out during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon basically unified Europe. And then what Britain did was finance 7 wars against Napoleon. They lost 6 and they won the 7th. I think that at the end of World War II, first of all, there was a lot of tremendous goodwill among the Europeans for what America did, right? I mean, they did a lot of sacrifices to save Europe from fascism. And so the Europeans were very grateful. And the real concern was that if America retreated back into its continental fortress, which is what America did at the end of World War I, then another threat would arise in Europe, possibly the Soviet Union, right? And so the Europeans were very much interested in ensuring that America stayed interested in European affairs. And that's what led to the NATO alliance and the Marshall Plan. And America itself recognized that if it did not help the Europeans, then communism was ascended. Communism had already won in the Soviet Union, and it was clearly going to triumph in China. So now you have a combination of both Soviet Union and China. And so that really scared American policymakers. So it was in their best interest to revitalize the Europeans and the Japanese as soon as possible. And that's what led, of course, to the Marshall Plan. So I think that it was a combination of idealism and a combination of goodwill, as well as just realpolitik, a long-term strategic planning. In the Bretton Woods Conference, 1944, was to establish the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, something called the exorbitant privilege. And America did this to the benefit of Europe, because what this meant was that America was basically financing the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, right? Because Europe was devastated by war, and they needed to rebuild the factories and manufacturing, but they needed an outlet. And consumers, right? So Americans agreed to buy from Europe, and America would also sell to Europe. And the point was to very quickly build the manufacturing capacity of Europe as well as America. And this was all made possible because of the US dollar. The problem is that when you have fiat currency, there's always a risk that you print too much money, that you lose financial discipline. So the agreement was that US dollar would be pegged to gold. So at any time, Europeans could reimburse the US dollars for gold. And this worked out really well for the first 10 years, and it led to tremendous post-war prosperity. But over time, the Americans started to overreach, started to abuse this exorbitant privilege in Vietnam, right? So basically, America was financing this silly war in Vietnam that served no strategic purpose. Then you had the space race, where America was spending billions of dollars to send a man to the moon. And then there was the Great Society of Lyndon B. Johnson, which was tremendous for the American people, but it made the Europeans question how much gold Americans actually had at Fort Knox. So the French famously sent a frigate, a ship to New York to pick up their gold and take it back to France. And after that led to something called Nixon shock in 1971, where Richard Nixon said that the US dollar would no longer be pegged to gold. Now you have a problem. Like, if you're not pegged to gold, then how do you determine the value of your currency? And so Nixon did 2 things, which was crucial. Basically established the world order that we live in today, okay? The first thing he did was he signed a deal with Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia would only sell its oil in US dollars. That led to something called the petrodollar, right? Which is now the basis of the US dollar. But the other thing that Nixon did was also very important, which people don't really discuss, is he went to China and he made a deal with China to become trading partners, where China would basically export its cheap labor, and in return, they would get US dollars. So these two deals became the basis of the new global economy. And when the Soviet Union fell, this system then became the global financial order. And this was fine. The problem is that there was excess capital being produced around the world, and it all went to America. At this time, America was shifting its manufacturing to China. So the economy of America became very unbalanced. It shifted from a focus on manufacturing to a focus on financing. So Wall Street started to, explode in both financial and power, and that led to hubris. And then Wall Street, because it had to create financial vehicles to absorb all this foreign capital, started to invent all these risky derivatives, such as the CDOs, collateral debt obligations. And this, of course, led to the 2008 subprime crisis. And at this point in history, essentially, the entire global economy should have collapsed. Why? Because Wall Street had basically bundled the entire global economy together so that if one part of the system collapsed, the entire system collapsed. The system didn't collapse because something happened, which is that China bailed out the world by printing all this money to build infrastructure throughout China, okay? So China basically became the consumer for the world, gobbling up all these raw materials in order to build its skyscrapers, its high-speed rail. And that worked out really well for the world. But then China said, well, you know what? Before we were exporting our cheap labor, and now we are financing the global economy. So we want to have a greater say over global affairs. We want our companies like Huawei to go to Africa and sell our products and compete against Apple. And the Americans didn't like that. And that's what led to the Trump tariffs when he came into office in 2016, right? The first thing he did was to sanction these Chinese companies. And that's what led to the trade war. And so you have all this instability now in the system because China's trying to contribute heavily to the global economy, but it wants more political power because of this. And the Americans are, no, we are still the hegemon. You have to listen to us. So the 2008 Great Financial Crisis was a heavy blow. Then this trade war of China was also another heavy blow. But the next heavy blow was, of course, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because after that happened, America started to use its financial weaponry to sanction Russia, right? So it basically removed Russia from the SWIFT system, and it froze Russia's $300 billion in assets in Europe and in America. And when it did this, it actually backfired. Because remember, the entire global financial order is based on legitimacy and reputation. And when you steal someone's money, you destroy your reputation. So Putin's response was, wow, $300 billion is the best money I've ever spent in order to collapse the American-led global financial order. So this is what's led to a lot of the issues that we have today, where underpinning the global financial order is the US dollar, but people don't have as much faith in the US dollar as possible. You compensate for that by using military power, right? And this helps us understand this war in Iran. I mean, we have to assume that the Americans are planning for a short, decisive war to control Iran. And once you control Iran, you control the entire Strait of Hormuz. You control all the resources. You can control global trade. Also, what's really important is you prevent a Russia-Iran-China alliance from forming, okay? Because once that happens, once China, Russia, and Iran together and create this trading bloc, it achieves the heartland. And then Europe comes in, then Middle East comes in, then Africa comes in through BRICS. So from an economic perspective, Americans didn't have a choice in the matter in that the US dollar was extremely unstable. People didn't have any faith in it anymore. And so you had to use force to remind people that the US dollar is still the only global reserve currency. And so they went into Iran hoping to control that crucial choke point of resources and trade. And it's really blown up in their faces. What I've observed is that Trump and America, they're behaving exactly the way that an empire decline behaves, which is that they suffer from a toxic and lethal combination of both hubris and desperation, meaning that they continue to underestimate the resilience and resolve of the Iranians, and they are desperate for a knockout punch as quickly as possible. Trump wants this war to end as soon as possible because he knows that the longer this war drags on, the worse the economy will suffer, the worse his polling will be, and the more likely the stock market will tank. So he's looking for a knockout punch. And right now, if you're looking for a quick solution, if you're looking for a gamble, well, your best option is Kharg Island. Because as you point out, that is where Iran exports 90% of its oil, primarily to China. But the first issue is that Khark Island is not as important economically as people believe. That's the first issue, meaning that even if you were to secure Khark Island, Iran does have workarounds where they can just ship from the coast. Issue number two is that Iran needs financing for this war. And now they're using this oil as financing, as collateral financing. But if the Chinese and the Americans want to strangle Iran, then it's not in their best interest to see Iran destroyed. Then they're going to provide financing anyway. And look, the reality is that now that oil is shooting up in price, this benefits tremendously, right? So Putin can take all this oil riches and finance Iran in fighting this war, because Russia has the most to lose if Iran loses this war and there's regime change. And the reason why is that if Iran were to fall, this opens up the Russian southern flank to the Americans, because Azerbaijan is an Israeli-American ally. And if Iran were to fall, then the Americans and Israelis could stage operations from the south. Also, Iran has been providing a lot of support to Russia in the Ukraine war. So Russia is getting most of its drones from Iran. So Foreign Minister Sergei has said that Russia will protect Iran. And there's been reporting from American news outlets that American intelligence believes that Russia is providing targeting for the Iranians. So all these drone strikes, all these ballistic missile strikes, they're getting intelligence and targeting from the Russians, which, by the way, is what NATO did in Ukraine, right? So from the Russian perspective, it's payback. So the Russians are heavily invested in the Iranians winning this war. The Chinese are pragmatic. They really don't care. They see Iran more as a major supplier of oil that they need. But if they need to shift supply routes, they can do so. And another issue is this. If you attack the economic lifeline of Iran, they now have incentive to strike at the oil refineries of the GCC. And this would cause the price of oil to spike. Remember, Iranians have said that their goal is to spike the price of oil to $200 a barrel. And so what they're saying is that we're going to fight a very long war of attrition that could last years. So I don't see what the strategic benefit of taking Khark Island is. And the last problem, and this is the most important, is that once you take Khark Island, you expose the Marines to drone strikes and artillery strikes from the coast, which means that you now need to send in more Marines to secure the coast, right? But then you expose these Marines to attacks from the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, right? Which means that now you have to invest 100,000 troops to go after Iran's underground missile facilities. And this is exactly what happened in Vietnam. The great irony of all this is that the Marine Expeditionary Force that is going to Iran is the same force that went into Vietnam and marked the first major ground involvement of the Americans in about 1965. They basically went into Da Nang and secured the Air Force base. And at first it was like 3,500 soldiers.